The town of Eldom had a way of folding time between its fingers, keeping it slow and tender, like dough in the hands of an old baker. It was the kind of place where porch swings creaked more than car engines, and folks still left pies on their neighbors' windowsills just because they could. Eldom's streets were lined with crumbling stone fences, crooked mailboxes, and wildflowers that insisted on blooming in ditches. Nothing rushed here. Even the wind wandered gently, weaving its way through willow trees and gossip alike, and while the town seemed simple to an outsider, anyone who lived there long enough knew Eldom had ears. Secrets didn't hide for long, not because people went looking for them, but because the silence had a way of talking. You could feel it when you walked past the old shoe repair shop that hadn't seen business in a decade, or when you paused at the corner of Hillcrest and Lantern Lane, where that girl vanished years ago, and no one ever said her name out loud. But most of all, you could feel it outside the little flower shop at the edge of Maple Street. It sat modestly between an abandoned post office and a thrift store with more stories than merchandise. The paint on the shutters had peeled down to a weary blue, and ivy had claimed the left side of the porch like it had something to prove. The sign above the door still read Evelyn's Blooms, even though Evelyn had passed nearly 7 years ago, and the shop now belonged to Amara James, a woman as quiet as she was unforgettable. Amara moved through the world like fog, gentle, mysterious, and impossible to hold. She was neither shy nor timid, but simply selective with her words, like she believed each one had to earn its way into the air. People found it strange at first. In a town where even the dogs barked about people's business, silence was considered either dangerous or divine. But Amara didn't seem to mind what anyone thought of her. She came in each morning before the sky had fully shaken off its darkness, sweeping the floor as the sun rose like honey across the windows. She kept her bouquets orderly, her work table clean, and her heart. Well, that was the one thing no one had ever seen. She spoke to customers in soft tones, her voice like wind brushing through tall grass, barely more than a whisper, but always warm. People came to her for more than flowers. They came because somehow she always knew exactly what they needed: sunflowers for joy, peonies for apologies, irises for new beginnings. She never asked questions, never pried, and still she understood. There was an unspoken wisdom about her, as though she had lived 3 lives before this one, and carried their lessons in her bones. Children loved her in the way that only children can, without needing a reason. They lingered near her shop after school, drawing pictures in the dirt, and waiting for the moment she'd appear with leftover petals in her apron pocket, handing them out like confetti for the forgotten. But Amara hadn't always been a woman of silence. There was a time when laughter fell from her lips easily, when her eyes danced with dreams, and her hands reached for more than stems and ribbons. That was before Ryan Carter. He was the kind of man who could make a room tilt just by walking into it. Not loud, not arrogant, just magnetic. With a slow grin and a steady voice, he had a way of making people feel like they were the only ones in the world worth listening to. Ryan had been her son for 6 long years, and she in turn had been his shadow, following wherever he went, believing his warmth would always shine her way. They had made plans in that flower shop, plans whispered between bouquets and sealed with the dust of promises. Eldom had seen them together so long, folks stopped saying their names separately. Ryan and Amara, they'd say, the way you'd mention salt and pepper or day and night. But love, as the old folks in Eldom often said, doesn't always age well. Sometimes it curdles. And one day, without thunder, without warning, Ryan left. Not for solitude, not for space, but for a woman named Courtney Blake, who wore red heels to breakfast and smiled like every room owed her applause. Courtney had grown up 2 towns over, but strutted into Eldom like she was claiming land. She was younger, flashier, louder, and she took what she wanted, including Ryan. When Ryan left, he didn't do it quietly. No, he peeled off Amara's name from his life like wallpaper in a house he no longer wanted. He told people she had grown too small for him, that her silence felt like a cage. He said she had no fire, no fight, and Courtney? She added fuel to his version of the story, painting herself as the spark he had needed all along. The 2 of them paraded their new love like a homecoming float, full of waves and glitter and show. They laughed louder when Amara walked by. Courtney, bold as brass, once passed Amara in the grocery store aisle and said, "Some women just don't know how to keep a man," with a smile that sliced like a razor hidden in sugar. Amara didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She just placed her apples in her basket and moved on. People waited for her to react, to crack, to cry, to curse. But nothing came. No tears down the church pew, no late-night calls to friends, no sudden closure of the flower shop. Instead, she returned to her roses and her ribbon, to her still mornings and gentle evenings. She didn't shrink. She didn't chase. She simply continued. And in that quiet continuation, in the absence of drama or revenge, something began to stir. The same town that once whispered about her silence now found itself humbled by it. Because there is a kind of strength that doesn't need to roar. It just stands, rooted and unshakable. Eldham's community center hadn't seen so much movement in years. Dust that had been sleeping on the windowsills was swept out by volunteers, and the old wooden floor, usually quiet except for Sunday craft club, groaned under the weight of tables, folding chairs, and endless feet dragging decorations from dusty closets. Word had spread like brush fire. There was going to be a town fundraiser, and everyone was expected to show face. It wasn't about the cause, it never really was. It was about presence, about being seen, about reminding others that you still existed. Some came for the music, others for the free food, but most came for the eyes. In Eldham, reputation wasn't just carried, it was worn like clothing. And there was a buzz around who'd be attending, who hadn't been seen in a while, who might show up with someone new on their arm. Of course, Amara James's name floated through these conversations like a feather in the wind. Some wondered if she'd come at all. Others scoffed and said she had no reason to. But deep down, even the nosiest of them hoped she would. Not because they liked her, but because she carried a mystery that made people itch to uncover what lay beneath her silence. And when the day of the event arrived, and people were already gathering in their best denim and Sunday dresses, there she was, stepping out of a quiet gray sedan, hair pulled back, dress plain but beautiful, eyes steady as the sea before a storm. She didn't walk in to make a scene. She walked in because she was invited, and that was enough. Some faces turned the moment she entered. Conversations paused for half a second, not long enough to be rude, but just long enough to sting. She greeted the receptionist at the door with a nod, nothing more. She took a program and folded it neatly in her hand as she walked slowly across the hall, passing clusters of people who barely concealed their sideways glances. There were no theatrics to her presence, and yet it felt like she carried her own weather. The lights above her head buzzed softly, the band on stage began tuning instruments, and someone spilled lemonade in the corner, but it was Amara who held the room. Not through loudness or attention, but through the gravity of her calm. She chose a seat near the back, not out of fear but preference. She liked watching things unfold, not because she wanted to judge, but because she had learned that observation often revealed more than confrontation. And while she sat quietly, tucking her purse neatly beneath her chair, they entered. Ryan Carter in a crisp button-down and rolled sleeves, with Courtney Blake at his side in a fire-red dress that shimmered with every step. They made sure to walk down the center aisle, laughing at something no one else could hear, their performance as polished as it was pointed. When Courtney caught sight of Amara seated toward the back, she slowed her stride just enough to whisper something into Ryan's ear, loud enough to trigger his smirk. Then they passed by, pretending not to see her, though the weight of their glance was unmistakable. Courtney's laughter was the kind that didn't come from joy. It was sharp like broken glass tucked inside wrapping paper, meant to sparkle but meant to cut. She threw her head back dramatically at every joke Ryan made, nudging him with her elbow like they were teenagers at a dance. Everything about her screamed spectacle, and she knew it. She tugged at her hem, adjusted her neckline, and made eye contact with anyone who dared look her way, holding their gaze just long enough to make them uncomfortable. But when her eyes met Amara's across the room, she hesitated for a second. It was fleeting, barely noticeable, but it was there. Amara didn't react. She didn't smile, didn't frown, didn't even blink too quickly. She just sat there, her face unreadable, her hands folded softly in her lap like she had all the time in the world. And that unsettled Courtney more than any insult ever could, because in her world of noise, silence was unnerving. Silence meant control. Amara's stillness stripped her of the power she thought she held, and she didn't know how to handle it. So she leaned in close to Ryan, whispered something mocking, and the two of them giggled like children hiding stolen candy, but Amara remained unmoved. Because when you've already lost everything you thought you needed, you become immune to the little daggers others try to throw. Her armor wasn't made of anger, it was made of peace, and peace, when worn well, makes insecurity squirm. The night pressed on with music that tried too hard to be lively and conversations that tried too hard to be deep. Eldam's fundraiser had turned into more of a reunion, and not the kind people looked forward to. People mingled with small plates and smaller talk, eyeing one another over plastic cups of lukewarm punch. But in the midst of all the movement, Amara stayed seated for a long while, watching the dance of human behavior unfold. She saw Mrs. Langley pretend not to judge Clara's too young dress, saw the Simmons brothers avoid eye contact after last summer's land dispute, saw Pastor Neil sit too long at the pie table with Miss Gale. She saw it all, not because she was nosy, but because she had trained her heart to be still enough to see what others missed. Eventually she did rise, but not with drama. She moved to the refreshment table like a breeze, patient and unnoticed, until she reached for a cup and found herself face to face with Ryan. His hand brushed hers, not intentionally, but just enough to send a jolt of recognition through them both. He looked at her then, really looked, and for a moment, something softened in his eyes. Maybe it was regret, maybe it was memory, but before either could speak, Courtney appeared at his side, possessive and sweet all at once. "Need help choosing?" she asked, her voice syrupy with sarcasm. Amara looked at her, not with disdain, but with something far more disarming, pity, and then without a word, she turned and walked away. Because sometimes silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's the only voice that tells the truth. The first time he noticed her, it wasn't the way most men notice women. There was no slow scan from across the room, no flirtatious glance, no exaggerated excuse to get close. He saw her the way one notices an old tree standing alone in a field, something that's been there all along, but only reveals its magnificence when the light hits it just right. His name was Benjamin Hayes, though folks in Eldam had only started calling him by it recently. Before that, he was just that man who bought the Chapman house. He was the kind of presence that moved quietly but never went unnoticed. People said he came from money, real money, not just the kind that could buy a newer truck or pay off a second mortgage. The kind of money that didn't need proving, but he didn't act like it. He dressed plainly, spoke kindly, and kept to himself more often than not. He showed up to the fundraiser alone, slipping through the crowd like a breeze through wheat there, but not demanding to be. And when he first saw Amara seated in the back of the room, her hands gently folded, her gaze unshaken by the laughter or tension that filled the hall, he paused. It wasn't attraction that held him, it was recognition. Not of the face, but of the presence. The way she seemed anchored to something far deeper than the room around her, as though she had found a truth most people spent their lives running from. He didn't approach her that night. Benjamin wasn't a man who chased curiosity. He let it grow slowly, the way one lets bread rise without rushing it, trusting the process. But he watched, not in a way that felt invasive, but in a way that understood value. He saw how she stood when she rose from her seat, not straight-backed like someone seeking approval, but with the poise of someone who had nothing left to prove. He noticed how others glanced at her, some with discomfort, others with confusion, and how she acknowledged none of it. Later, when the event was winding down and people began to scatter like birds after a storm, he found himself near the refreshment table where the lemonade had long run out and the cookies had gone stale. She was there too, her fingertips grazing a napkin as if deciding whether to take one or not. He didn't speak at first. He just stood beside her, letting the silence stretch. It didn't feel awkward. It felt like the kind of pause that allows the soul to breathe. Then he said something simple. "Your quiet is louder than most people's shouting." He hadn't planned it. The words came out on their own, unpolished but sincere. She turned to him, not surprised, not flattered, just present. "That's not always a compliment," she replied, her voice low and measured. He smiled, not because it was witty, but because it was true. From that moment a door opened. Not wide, not enough to invite assumptions, but enough to allow light to pass through. In the weeks that followed, Benjamin began appearing at the flower shop, never at the same time, never too frequently. He always came alone, usually mid-morning, sometimes just as Amara was finishing her arrangements for the day. The first few visits were business. He ordered simple bouquets, asked about seasonal blooms, requested flowers without the kind of frills most customers wanted. But it became clear he wasn't there for petals and stems. He asked about her work, not out of politeness, but genuine interest. He once said he admired how she worked with things that died quickly, yet still made them beautiful. She didn't offer much in return, at least not at first. She wasn't one to hand out details like candy. But something about Benjamin's presence made her soften, not like something collapsing, but like something settling into place. He never rushed her. He never filled silences. He seemed to understand that not all pauses needed to be broken. There was a moment, perhaps 3 visits in, when he saw her struggling with a thorny rose and offered to help. She looked at him for a long beat and said, "Some things you just have to handle yourself." He didn't take offense. He simply nodded and stepped back, respecting a boundary she hadn't even voiced. That was the thing about Benjamin. He didn't try to fix her, and that in itself began to heal her. People in Eldom began to notice, of course. Not loudly, not all at once, but through whispers exchanged over fences and glances shared in the church parking lot. They noticed Benjamin's car outside her shop more often than it should have been. Noticed how she had started wearing a soft shade of coral on her lips, how her blouses had a little more shape, how the lights in the flower shop stayed on longer some evenings. Courtney noticed too. She once passed by the shop and saw Amara inside, standing close to Benjamin. Their heads leaned together in a way that suggested safety rather than seduction. It rattled her. She mentioned it to Ryan casually, as though it didn't matter, but her tone betrayed her. Ryan only shrugged, muttered something dismissive, but his eyes had that faraway glaze, the kind that meant he'd seen something he couldn't unsee. What none of them knew, what none of them could understand, was that Benjamin saw in Amara not a woman to conquer or to save, but a soul to walk beside. There were no grand gestures, no flowers sent to her own shop, no public declarations, just presence, just consistency. And in a world that had mistaken volume for value, that was the quietest kind of miracle. Benjamin had a way of being present without pressing in, and Amara found herself both comforted and unnerved by that. It had been a long time since she had shared space with a man who didn't need her to shrink or sparkle to feel seen. With Ryan, it had always felt like performance, like she had to shape-shift to match his expectations, be soft but not passive, smart but not intimidating, affectionate but not too needy. She didn't fully realize how exhausted she'd become from tiptoeing around his ego until Benjamin showed up in her life like still water, clear, unhurried, and reflective. He didn't demand anything. He didn't ask for her history or offer unsolicited interpretations of her silence. He simply listened, not just to her words, but to her pauses, her sighs, the way she hesitated before choosing a flower. There was one afternoon in late October when the air had just begun to carry that crisp bite of coming winter, and Benjamin arrived with 2 cups of coffee, one black, one with cream, placing both on the counter without asking her preference. Amara raised an eyebrow. "You trying to guess what kind of person I am?" He smiled faintly. "No, I just figured if I brought both, one would be right, and the other wouldn't go to waste." That was the thing about Benjamin. He didn't try to predict her. He made room for her. The townspeople had started talking more openly by then. The whispers that had once been sealed behind hands and shared across back porches had found their way into casual conversation. Mrs. Reynolds, who ran the fabric store on Elm, commented on how Amara had started wearing scarves again, just like she used to, back when she and Ryan were still a name said in one breath. Mr. Dean, the retired school principal, noted that her shop's front window had been cleaned more regularly, and the displays inside looked brighter, fresher. To some, those changes were small, maybe even meaningless. But to those who understood grief, they were signs, quiet signals of someone who had stopped merely surviving and had begun, however cautiously, to live again. Amara wasn't unaware of the attention. She felt it every time she walked into a room. But she didn't adjust her posture to match their expectations anymore. She didn't walk faster to avoid lingering eyes or speak more to soothe uncomfortable silences. Benjamin had never once asked her to defend who she was or where she had been. That freedom gave her the courage to stop defending herself to the world. She began to let laughter back in, not the loud, performative kind, but small flickers of it, like little candles lighting one at a time. She still moved quietly, still spoke in gentle tones, but something in her had begun to unfold, like the petals of a tulip easing open after a long winter, uncertain but determined. Ryan noticed before he admitted it to himself. He started finding excuses to drive past the shop, convincing himself it was just coincidence or habit. Sometimes he'd stop by the bakery down the street, pretending not to look over, even though his eyes always did. There was a tightness in his chest he couldn't explain, especially on the day he saw Benjamin unlocking the shop door for Amara while carrying a box of vases she couldn't manage on her own. It wasn't jealousy exactly. Jealousy requires ownership, and Ryan had given that up. No, it was something harder to name. Maybe it was the unsettling realization that the woman he thought would never thrive without him was glowing in a way she never had with him. Maybe it was that her silence, which he had once called weakness, had become something radiant in the hands of a man who knew how to hold it. Courtney caught him looking more than once. The first time she let it slide, assuming it was just a flicker of nostalgia, but by the third time, when Ryan's gaze lingered too long and his answers grew too short, she started to ask questions, passive ones, designed to sound like jokes, but sharp underneath. "You ever regret letting that one go?" she asked one morning, stirring her coffee a little too fast. Ryan didn't respond right away. He just looked out the window and muttered, "Not everything you lose is a mistake, but not everything you keep is a blessing either." Courtney laughed, but it was hollow, and both of them knew it. One Sunday afternoon, when the streets were quiet, and the air was thick with the scent of drying leaves, Benjamin sat on the wooden bench outside Amara's shop while she closed up inside. He wasn't waiting on anything in particular. He simply liked being nearby. There was something about the space they shared that didn't need labeling. It wasn't a courtship in the traditional sense. There had been no declarations, no questions about exclusivity or the future. What existed between them was more sacred than that, an understanding that didn't need language. When Amara stepped outside and sat beside him, she let her shoulder graze his without apology. He offered her the last bite of a cinnamon bun he'd brought from the bakery, and she took it without hesitation. The sky overhead was a dull gray, clouds thick and unmoving. There was no wind, no birdsong, just the sound of leaves falling. And in that stillness, she finally asked him something she hadn't dared until now. "What made you come here? Eldam, I mean." Benjamin stared straight ahead for a long while. "Sometimes you outgrow places," he said. "But sometimes they outgrow you. I needed somewhere I didn't have to be anybody." She nodded slowly. "And here you are, being someone anyway." He looked at her, this time not with curiosity, but with something closer to reverence. "Only because you are," he said. That was the first time Amara felt something shift deep within her. Not a flood, not a spark, but a quiet release. The ache of abandonment, the echo of Ryan's betrayal, the shame that had clung to her name like a second skin. It didn't disappear, but it loosened, and for once she didn't feel like she had to carry it alone. There was no announcement, no save the date posted on bulletin boards, and certainly no whispers shared through the quilting circle at the church. The news arrived the way winter crept into Eldam, soft, steady, and undeniable. It started with a few confused glances at the coffee shop when Benjamin was seen picking up invitations printed on cream paper with embossed gold lettering. Then came the look on Mrs. Eloise's face when she swore she saw Amara trying on a satin dress behind the curtain of Daisy's dress boutique, one she had previously avoided like a child avoids castor oil. But it was old Mr. Avery, who worked part-time at the printing shop, who couldn't keep his mouth shut. "Wedding invites," he'd said, wiping his glasses with the edge of his shirt. Didn't see the bride's name, but that's Benjamin Hayes's signature if I've ever seen one. Still, most of Eldom chose not to believe it until they saw it. The idea of Amara James, quiet, unobtrusive Amara, getting married at all was one thing. But to Benjamin, the man who had entered Eldom like a secret and moved through it like he already belonged, it was too surreal. Some called it a miracle, others a scandal, but none could deny it sparked a wildfire of speculation that spread across barbershops, bakery counters, and even the evening radio segment hosted by Miss Peggy. But through it all, Amara said nothing. She kept showing up at her shop, tending her flowers, arranging centerpieces for the library fundraiser, accepting congratulations with a small nod but no elaboration. And the silence, her signature, her strength, held steady. The reception hall was the old brick building beside the train tracks, the one people always said should be torn down, but never did because it held too many memories. Its walls were weathered but strong, and for that one evening, it had been transformed into something that shimmered with intention. Ivory linens hung over tables like snowfall, fairy lights wound their way through exposed beams, and garlands of white roses and eucalyptus framed the windows. It wasn't extravagant, it wasn't loud, it was precisely what it needed to be. The kind of beauty that didn't beg for attention, it simply existed and waited to be noticed. The guests arrived slowly, like leaves drifting onto a lake. Most came with curiosity tucked beneath their smiles. Others came out of obligation, unsure what to expect but unwilling to miss what was sure to become the talk of the town. Courtney Blake arrived in a dress that could have doubled as a spotlight, sequined and fitted, each step announcing her like a drum beat. She clung to Ryan's arm not for romance, but for reinforcement. Ryan, in contrast, looked subdued. His tie was too tight, his gaze unfocused. He hadn't spoken much since they got the invitation. "We should go," Courtney had insisted. "It'll be good to show face." But as the string quartet began to play and guests took their seats, there was an uneasiness in him he couldn't explain. And when the music shifted into something soft and haunting, and the doors at the end of the room eased open to reveal Amara, graceful, radiant, utterly unbothered by every eye upon her, something inside Ryan collapsed without warning. Amara did not wear a veil. She didn't need one. She walked down the aisle as though she had spent her whole life learning how to carry herself through fire without ever smelling of smoke. Her dress was simple, made of satin that caught the light and held it like it was born for her. No lace, no diamonds, just quiet elegance. She didn't glance left or right. She kept her gaze forward, chin steady, hands folded around a bouquet of white lilies. Each step was a poem, each pause between movements a prayer. Benjamin stood waiting at the end of the aisle, not with tears in his eyes or a grin too wide, but with the kind of stillness reserved for men who have finally found peace. His suit was charcoal gray, his boutonniere a single wild daisy, a nod to her shop and the first flower he ever bought from her. The officiant spoke briefly, and the ceremony moved with ease. There were no exaggerated vows or teary speeches, just clarity, intention, mutual knowing. The guests clapped politely, but it was the silence right after the ceremony, the moment when Benjamin took her hand and kissed her temple with reverence, that settled the air in a way applause never could. There was no denying what stood between them. It wasn't the flash of new love. It was the calm that follows a long storm. Ryan's hand fell from Courtney's waist during that moment. He didn't even realize it. He was watching Amara as if seeing her for the first time, and realizing he had never known her at all. At the reception, the tables filled quickly, the food passed around with compliments, and the small band played music soft enough to let voices carry. Amara moved through the room like a melody, soft, familiar, unforgettable. She didn't wear the triumph of a woman who had been proven right. She wore the quiet joy of a woman who had nothing to prove. Guests congratulated her, hugged her, clapped her shoulders, some out of genuine warmth, others out of curiosity masked as politeness. Benjamin stayed close but not possessive. He let her shine, he always had, and when the moment came for the couple's first dance, they moved slowly across the wooden floor, not like dancers trying to impress, but like two people honoring time. Ryan and Courtney watched from a table near the back. Courtney picked at her plate, her words few and distracted. Ryan was stone still. The envy that settled in his chest wasn't bitter, it was mournful. He understood now that Amara's silence had never been emptiness. It was deep. And he had mistaken depth for distance, something many men never learned to tell apart. When the evening drew to a close, and Amara stood beside Benjamin at the exit, thanking each guest with a soft smile and a sincere word, her eyes finally met Ryan's as he approached. There was no hatred there, no triumph, just peace. He tried to speak, but the words caught somewhere behind his pride. She nodded once, softly, and turned to the next guest. It was done, and nothing else needed to be said. The following morning came with a hush that felt sacred. Eldam woke slowly, as if the town itself had taken a deep breath the night before and wasn't quite ready to exhale. There was dew on every blade of grass, the kind that catches the light and makes everything shimmer like it's been touched by grace. Inside the flower shop, the light moved differently now. It touched each petal with something warmer, softer, as though the room had been blessed in silence. Amara stood by the front window, her fingers tracing the rim of a teacup she hadn't sipped from, eyes lingering on the road outside. The street was quiet, except for the occasional engine hum in the distance, and a bird that kept returning to the telephone line outside her shop. Her name had changed now, but her spirit had not. She was still herself, just more full. She wasn't waiting for anything in particular. She had no need to. The waiting season of her life had ended. It had ended not with fireworks or applause, but with something far more rare, peace. There was no victory speech playing in her mind. She felt no need to relive Ryan's regret or Courtney's silence. Those chapters had closed gently, like a breeze through an open door. And as she stood there, the weight that had once sat in her chest like a stone was gone, not forgotten, but dissolved like salt in warm water, transformed into something she no longer carried alone. Benjamin entered quietly, as he always did. He didn't announce himself with words or movement. He had learned that Amara could hear intention better than sound. She turned just as he crossed the doorway, and their eyes met with the comfort of two people who had stopped measuring time by clocks and had started measuring it by presence. He walked to her without urgency, placed a warm scone on the counter, and poured coffee into the second mug that had been sitting, waiting, as if her heart already knew he'd come. They didn't speak for a while. The room didn't need conversation. He moved to the stool near the back and pulled out a notepad where he'd been sketching ideas for a greenhouse they wanted to build behind the shop. Nothing fancy, just a space for herbs and wildflowers, maybe a little bench where customers could sit and rest. As he sketched, she arranged a vase of pale dahlias, carefully turning each bloom until it faced the right way, not because she had to, but because care had become her language. There was something unspoken between them that morning, something gentle but unshakable. The wedding had been a public moment, yes, but this quiet partnership, this rhythm of shared silence, was the marriage. This was where the vows lived, tucked into the folds of ordinary days. Not in what was promised out loud, but in what was honored without needing to be said. A few days later, Amara found herself walking through the part of Eldam she used to avoid. The road curved past Ryan's old neighborhood, the one with the maple tree that had been split by lightning 2 summers ago. The bark was still scarred, but the tree had survived. She hadn't meant to take that route, but her feet, unbothered by old fears, seemed to decide it for her. When she reached the last corner before the street opened into view, she paused, not out of dread, but reflection. It was strange how places could hold memory in their soil. She glanced across the street where the two of them had once picked out pumpkins together, and then at the driveway where she had waited in silence on nights he came home late and unapologetic. None of it hurt now. It was distant, like reading a letter written by someone you no longer are. She crossed the street slowly, not to linger, but to pass through, and as she moved, she saw Courtney step out from the passenger side of a parked car. They locked eyes only for a second. Courtney stiffened, not with anger, but with the discomfort of someone standing before a mirror that showed more truth than she could handle. Amara offered a soft nod, not as forgiveness, not as pity, but as release. Courtney didn't respond, and that was fine. Some people weren't meant to meet you in healing. They were only meant to teach you how to get there. On a Sunday afternoon, the first one since the wedding, Amara and Benjamin sat beneath the old sycamore tree behind the flower shop, watching bees hum through a patch of lavender. There were no pressing tasks. The shop was closed. The world felt paused in the best way. Amara leaned against his shoulder, her breathing slow and steady. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a story waiting to unfold or a wound waiting to close. She was no longer the woman left behind, the woman whispered about, or the woman pitied for her silence. She was simply a woman loved, seen, and whole. Benjamin reached for her hand without looking, and she met him halfway. No words passed between them, but everything that needed to be said lived in that quiet exchange. In that still moment, Amara realized she had found what she never thought she would again. Rest. Not in a person, but in herself. She had returned to herself, piece by piece, and with grace as her guide. And the silence that once felt like a tomb had become her sanctuary. The same silence that had been used to mock her, doubt her, and misunderstand her was now the place where she was fully alive. It had taken losing what she thought she needed to discover what she was truly made of, and as the wind stirred gently through the branches overhead, carrying the scent of roses and something sacred, Amara closed her eyes, not to escape, but to savor. For the first time in her life, the silence didn't ask anything from her. It gave everything back. If you've listened to Amara's story and found even a piece of yourself in her quiet strength, then this moment is for you. Sometimes in life, the world will try to measure your worth by how loudly you speak, how fast you move, how flashy your wins are. But don't be fooled. There is power in stillness. There is beauty in grace. There is healing in choosing peace over noise. Maybe you've been mocked for your silence. Maybe you've walked through a season where everything you gave was taken for granted. Or maybe, just like Amara, you've had to rebuild yourself in private, while others laughed in public. But hear this clearly, you are not forgotten, you are not invisible. And your silence has never meant weakness, it has meant wisdom. Some people may overlook you, some may misunderstand you, but the right people, the people who carry peace, kindness, and God's timing in their hearts, will recognize your value without you having to prove a single thing. So don't rush your healing, don't chase validation, stay rooted in who you are. And when the time is right, God will bring people into your life who see your heart clearly, not for what you say, but for who you are. Now let us pray together. Thank you for the listener who's hearing this right now. Thank you for their quiet strength, their gentle spirit, and their heart that's been through more than words can say. Lord, for every soul who's been laughed at, left behind, or overlooked, let them know that you were watching the whole time. Let them feel your comfort in their silence and your presence in their pain. We ask you, God, to bless every person who has suffered in secret but still chose to stand. Lift the weight from their shoulders. Whisper peace into every anxious thought. Bring them rest where they've only known restlessness. Help them walk boldly in the quiet grace you've placed inside them. Remind them that their story is not over, that you are the author, and you never leave a sentence unfinished. Surround them with people who love deeply, give freely, and speak kindly. And when the time comes, let their joy speak louder than their past ever could. In the name of Jesus, the one who sees what the world overlooks, we say, Amen. And if this prayer touched something in your spirit, don't be shy. Type Amen in the comments. Let heaven see your agreement. Let your spirit speak, even if your voice is quiet. Your peace is coming, your healing is unfolding, and your silence has always carried more power than the world could ever understand. Amen.